Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Samach Vav, and the daf starts with a statement of Rabbi Zera, in which Rabbi Zera equates two things, and that is a matana that was given by someone verbally, orally, before his death, and a get that the Baal appointed those who would write and give the get before his death. And in both cases, when there was a story of Rav Avina, in which a person was Yotze Lekolar in the Mishnah on Daf Samach Amud Beis on the bottom of the Amud, and he gave a gift verbally to Rav Avina, and Rabbi Zera told him, pack your bags and go collect this gift. Because even though there was no Masechet, because he was Yotze Lekolar, therefore the matana is chal even without a kinyan. And the statement of Rav Huna is quoted here on the second line on Daf Samach Vav Amud Aleph. The Omer Rav Huna later on Daf Ayin Beis says Gito Kimat Nasa. There's an equation between a get in the case of a person who's on his deathbed. He's called a Shchimera, and he commands to give a get to his wife, and a matana in which a person is on his way out, so to speak, or at least we assume he's about to die, and he gives a verbal matana. And that matana is valid, and therefore Avina, you could collect this matana of 400 zuz. And the equation that Rav Huna postulates takes us one step further. What happens im amad? If the person, instead of dying, has a miraculous recovery, and we equate matana and get. In matana, if he becomes healthy again, then the matana is invalid. It's now determined to be as if he had made a t'nai that if I die, the matana should be valid, but if not, the matana is not in effect. And the same thing in get, if a person, even though he didn't make a stipulation that if I die from this disease, the get should be chal, nevertheless, that's a tacit or an implicit condition. Like in the case of matana, therefore, Ahmad Choser. And now we take the equation in the other direction. In the case of a get of Shchimera, he never actually said, deliver the get. All he said was, on his deathbed, kisvu get leishti, just write the get. Nevertheless, we assume that he really meant to say tnu, but he was so tarud that he left out the word tnu, and we fill it in. So to a matana, once he says, give this gift, even in the absence of a kinyan, the matana is chal. And we're up to maskifla Rabbi Abba. So now Rabbi Abba is going to ask a kasha on Rabbi Zera. And he says the following: how far are you going to take this equation? Ima matana yeshna liachar misa get yeshna liachar misa? Are you going to make the next step and say that if before he dies he commands to give a matana to so-and-so, we will deliver that matana even after Misa, even though during his lifetime the Nosein did not effectuate any kinyan whatsoever? Should we say, therefore, according to Rabbi Zera, that the same parallel halacha should apply to get, and therefore if a man says, give a get to my wife, and then he dies, we should give the get to his wife? Now, I just want to point out there is a possibility in the abstract world of knowledge of ideas in halacha that maybe we could give the get liachar misa. How so? Let's say a person would appoint a shliach to deliver a get, and then the mishaleach dies. The shliach is now standing in place of the mishaleach, and l'chora he might be able to give the get. And this is going to be a major machlokes between the Rambam and the Tur at the beginning of the next chapter in Masechet Gittin, which is called Mishachso Kordaikus, in a case where a man appointed a shliach to deliver a get to his wife, then he became a shota, and a shota is a la bardas, and therefore he's not royally gerushin. Can the shliach that he appointed give the get? And that's going to be a major machlokes between the Tur and the Rambam. So you see, there is a possibility that a shliach could operate once he was appointed when the mishaleach was in the effective position, even though now he's not effective, and therefore maybe the shliach could deliver the get even liachar misa of the mishaleach. However, if you take a look at Rashi here, which is about 8 lines down from the top of the Amud, Dibra Maskal liachar misa mi'ika, he says liachar shemeis mi megarsha. Rashi points out that who's the megarish? Meaning, if a person dies, he can no longer be a megarish. He's not alive. So that how could the shliach operate on behalf of the mishaleach if the mishaleach is no longer alive? What's he going to effectuate? A gerushin? The mishaleach is gone. But perhaps the answer to this question is zikas yibum. If the man has a brother and he has no children, when he dies, there's zikas yibum, which is in effect an extension of his ishus even after his death. The Gemara says, Hachi hashta. How can you equate matana and get with regard to liachar misa? Bishlai matana isa liachar misa. It's very shayach that the makabel matana could be zoche in the matana even after the death of the nosei matana. Now, it's not exactly clear to us why the Gemara has to go through this logic. Why didn't the Gemara just say that because of the takonas chachamim of shchiv meira and divrei shchiv meira are kiksuvim ukimesurim dami, then the makabel matana could be zoche through this takana of takana shchiv meira. And this is what the Mefarshim are going to try to work about. Why did the Gemara feel compelled to add this concept of matana isa liachar misa? Anyway, the Gemara goes on to say, "Get liachar misa mi'ika." Immediately with the death of the husband, she falls for yibum. As Rashi points out in the end of the Rashi that we saw before, umishas misa, Rashi writes, "Huskekol liyamam." So at that point already, there's no possibility to remove the ishus of the Baal through get because there's already a zika of yibum. So there's no possibility that the original Baal could be megarish his wife once she falls for yibum to his brother. And therefore we cannot compare get to matana. However, in the din of Rav Huna, in his equation, which is Omar Choser, or for example, the fact that there's no kinyan and yet it could be chal, here we have a perfectly mature and solid basis for comparison. So the Gemara now says that, you know what, Rabbi Abba never asked that kasha. We made a mistake. That kasha would not be a kasha on Rav Zera. But what was the kasha of Rabbi Abba on Rav Zera? Hachinko kasha. When do we apply the principle of matna shchimira and Rabbana made a takana that it's kiksuvim ukimesurim dami? That's only if he divvies up all his property. Once he divvies up all his property, he leaves himself absolutely bankrupt. You could turn his pocket upside down. There's not even a coin that would fall off. Then we see clearly that he is giving this matana as a shchimira, meaning that he doesn't expect to survive it. But in a case where, as we saw in the case of Rav Avina, the Yotzei Lakolar, that his name was Geneva, that he gave 400 zuz. That's called a miktas matnas chimera. He's not giving up the entire estate and all his possessions. Rabbanim only made a takon of divrei shkimera ksuvim dami, but no saying kol nechasav. Because then we understand clearly that the reason why he's emptying out all his possessions and his bank account is because he is going to die. But in the case where he gave partially and he only gave 400 zuz, then you know what? He's leaving money for himself and for his household. He's not a mitzvah machmas misa, and therefore comes under the general halacha matnas bari, and you need a kinyan, and therefore the matana would not be chal. So how could Rav Avina, according to Rab Zera, be zocher in this matana? It's only a miktas. So the Gemara says, Michlal, from the kasha of Rabbi Abba, we should derive the conclusion that Rav Huna savar lo boy kinyan. That Rav Huna was the one who said that we have this equation between matana and get, and based on the statement of Rav Huna, we assumed that Rabbi Avina could be zochen the 400 zuz, go pack your bags and pick it up. But now we're saying, based on the kasha Rabbi Abba, that there's no proof for Rab Zera based on Rav Huna, because Rav Huna holds that matana b'miktsas, in the case of matnas chimera, is not included in the takonas chacham, and it's not valid. But from the fact that Rav Huna himself, according to Rab Zera, was the basis for Rabbi Avina's being zoch in the matana, it must be that Rav Huna held that even in the case of a matnas chimera b'miktsas, you don't need a kinyan, and the takana applies. So the Gemara asks more kaimalon. The boy kinyan, a matnas chimera b'miktsas is like any matnas bari, and it's not chal without a kinyan. And the Gemara answers, shani hachad b'tzava machmas misu. You're right. Normally, if he only gives up a segment of his estate, it's not machmas misa. But in the case of a yotzei l'kolar, then we know for sure that he was mitzava machmas misa. And therefore, even in a matana b'miktsas, the matana is valid, and the makabel matana is zocher. So Gemara now goes back and asks from the opposite perspective. Michlal Rabbi Abba, who raised this kasha of matnas shchimera b'miktsas, that it should require a kinyan, savar mitzava machmasisa by a kinyan, even in a case where a person is being taken out to be executed, you still require matana of all nechasim, and in the case of matana b'miktsas, it's not chal v'kaimalon delo boy kinyan. We paskin that any case of mitzvah machmas misa, even if he's only giving miktsas, nevertheless the kinyan is chal. So what was Rabbi Abba's objection? From the fact that Rabbi Avina was only getting 400 zuz, it was clearly a case of matnas chimera machmas misa, and therefore lo boy kinyan. So now the Gemara goes back to the drawing board and says, no, Rabbi Abba's kasha was a different kasha. Ela Rabbi Abba hachiko kasha le chamra lo ka'omar dami de chamra lo ka'omar. Let's take a look and analyze. For this, we have to go back for a moment to Daf Samachei Amid Beis and read meticulously the language of the Yotzei Bekolar. Gneva Yotzei Bekolar Havi Kikavi Nofik Omar Havu Arba Mea Zuzi Rabbi Avina Michamra. He said, give him 400 zuz from the wine. Now, he didn't say give him 400 zuz of wine, and he didn't just say give him wine. This is a language that's almost a contradiction in terms. If he would have said chamra, okay, let's give him a amount of wine, a volume of wine that's market value at 400 zuz. If he would have said dmei chamra, let's just give him 400 zuz from the domim of the yayin, which means we'd have to sell the wine in order to give him and supply with 400 zuz, that would be okay. But what did he say? He said, give him 400 zuz mei chamra from the wine. So Rabbi Abba said, what is Rabbi Avina going to be zocheh? It's not shaykh to say that we take most from yayin. So what does it mean? Arba smeo suze me yayin. V'idach, but Rabbi Zera, who said that Rabbi Avina was zocheh in this matana, what was his opinion? That Gneva said, he declared arba meo suze me chamra. What does that mean? Kedeli Apple says kocho. He only wanted to give Rabbi Avina a very strong yipui koach. And here we have a long explanation of Rashi. Dibra maskil kedeli apos es kocho. So let's see if we can summarize in our own words Rashi. Rashi says the following. What the Yotzei Lekolar, the Gneva, what he wanted to guarantee was the following. If he would have said Yayin, just plain Chamra, then if, let's say, the Chamra got spoiled, or part of the Chamra got spoiled, then the Yorshim would say, you know what? That was the part that was given to this Mekabel Matana. That's what became spoiled. If, on the other hand, he would say Arbamio Zuzi Dmei Chamra, then once again, if, let's say, the most got lost, then the Yorshim would say that your most, meaning the Makabel Matonis most, who got lost. Therefore, Gneva said, Tnulo arba meos zuzi mechamra. What's the implication? He's taking achrayas, so to speak, for this matana. He says, whether it's the yayin itself, or an event that the yayin gets spoiled, then let it be the domim the most. And if the most get lost, then let it be the yayin. So he gave them, in a sense, those two options. Shalchu misam, and in fact, we had a message that came from Eretz Yisrael that if he says give most, make chamra, it's kedeli aposas kocha. This leads us to the mission. Mishaya mushlach lebar. A person is in a very dangerous situation. He's at the bottom of a bar. If he already declares, he yells out, Kol hashomeas kolo, anyone who hears my voice. Yichtov get leishti. And he mentions her name and he mentions the city. Harelu yichtavu v'yitnu. They can write and sign the get and give the get over to the Isha, because we assume that he decided to divorce his wife. Again, even though he didn't say tnu, he only said yichtavu, kol shaveas kolo yichtov, but nevertheless he was torrid because of his fear, and he left out the word tnu. Maybe it's a shade. How can he matter his wife based on this get? Maybe it's only a shade. That those who heard his voice saw that he looks like a human being. He has the figure of a human being. So Gemara says, Irunami, the shadim are so excellent and outstanding, they can present themselves as looking at a human figure. And the answer is Chazulei Babua. But we saw the tzel, we saw the shade. And the assumption is that a shade does not have shade. A shade does not have shade. Inunami iu lahu islahu babua. Even the shade can create this shade, this shadow. And the answer is the chazalei babua, they saw a shadow of a shadow. Maybe a shade could make a shadow of a shadow. Although a shade could have a shadow, but he cannot have and produce a shadow of a shadow. Now, our Girsa, it says, Yonasan B'ni. However, there's another Girsa, Yonasan Sheda. So I guess he was a shade, and his name was Yonasan. And he was a Baki in Hilchus Sheda. Okay, I grant you it's a human being. It's not a shade. It's a babua de babua. But maybe the husband was married to two wives, and one wife wanted to be Makalkel Hatsara, and therefore she says, give a get to my tsara. So she's hoping that Hatsara will now go out and marry someone else, and she'll never be able to return to her husband. So we're now quotes a brisa that we're not choshesh for it. Sarah, Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, B'shasa Sakana, if a person is in a life-threatening situation, for example, he's mushlach bebar, or according to the Rambam, it's a shas sakana because it's shas hashmad. His kosu v'nosnin, we can write the get for his wife and deliver it, afal pishay makirin, even though we're not able to see his face and identify him. Because if we don't do so, then he might die and he'll never be able to give her a get. Now here we have a machlokas how to interpret this Gemara. Is the Gemara just covering the last piece of Dilma Sarahi, and therefore Rabbi Shmuel is telling me we don't have to worry about it. Sarah b'shas sakana, we can write the get and give the get, even though we don't see that it's not a tzara. But we still have to be choshish. Maybe it's a shade, or do we say no? The Gemara now with Tanah Bei Rabbi Shmuel is covering even the chashash of a shade, and then afkamina is going to be whether you need babua to babua. If we're going to say the Gemara is only addressing the second chashash and saying that the Dilma Tzara chashash is gone because it's shasakana, then we don't need. Then we'll need babua to babua. But if we're saying that the Gemara, by quoting Rabbi Yishmael, is now addressing both chashashos, number one, whether it's a shade, number two, whether it's a tzara, then we don't need babua to babua. And now we're up to the Mishnah here. The second of the three Mishnayos on Daf Samach Vav. Habari sha'amar kisvu get leishti ratzel l'sachik. If the bari only said write a get, he did not mandate give the get, then he could play games with them. Meaning, he could say that I was only joking. I never meant that the get should be delivered. Ma'aseh b'bari echad, and now we're going to have a story about a bari, Sha'amarni mandated kisvu get li'ishti. And guess what? In this case, the Mishnah is going to validate the get, even though he only said kisvu get li'ishti, and that's going to be the Gemara's kasha ma'isa listar. The ola rosh hagag v'nafal umeis. Here we have two interpretations of the Rishonim, whether he slipped on a banana peel and died when he fell down, or he committed suicide. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel imei atzmo nafal. If we have reason to believe that he knew that he was going to die. Like, for example, let's say he was a suicide case. So then he was tarud, like we said before a person's death, he's tarud. And therefore, raise a get. Even though he didn't say more than kisvu, he didn't say tnu, we will deliver the get. He's like a sakana case that we discussed before, yotzel kolar, etc., etc. But in Ruach Techato, if on the other hand, something happened when he was up on the roof and circumstance beyond control, he died, ain't no get. He's a bari, and we're not going to say that he had kavana to give the get. So the Gemara asks immediately, Maisa listar. You started by saying in the Reisha that a bari, if he only says kisvu, it's not valid. Now you're telling me because he climbed up to the roof and he fell from the roof, therefore the get is valid, and he never commanded to give the get. And the Gemara answers, when does the Mishnah say that a bari who says kisvu, he can be masakik because he didn't say tnu? That's only because there's no hochiach tchava. But if it was hochiach sofa tchilaso, I raise a get. If we see that he was like a masukon, he was in sakana, or he's yotzil kol already, and he was about to jump off the roof, then in such a case, the get is valid. Ma'asenami b'bari shomer kis we get liishti v'ol rosh hagag v'nafal u'meis over Rav Shimon Gamliel v'yatz v'nafal is a get yemi ruach tachaso eino get. Hahu gavra di ol lebei knishta. He came into the shul. We'll call him Reuven. Ashkach, and he finds Mikra Yenuka Ubre, and he finds Shimon, who's a Malame Tinokos, and his son, we'll call him Levi. And Yehuda was there. So all told, it's this Hahu Gavra in front of three men. Amalahu, the one who came in, this Gavra, declares Beit Shreminach, 2 out of you 3. Nichtamu Gittin the basic. Write a get for my wife. Will be self shachar Mikra Yenuka. And Shimon, the Malame Tinokos, died. So now what we have is we have Shimon's son Levi, and we have Yehuda. So now the Gemara raises the following suffix. Would a person appoint a shliach in front of that person's father? Mi mashvu inish bra shlicha b'makom. Since there were 3 people there, we don't know for sure that the Hahu Gavra, who ultimately died, had appointed the Ben, we'd call him Levi, as a shliach, because since Reuven, Levi's father, was present, then it's not a kavod to a father to appoint a son as a shliach. Olo, or should we say no? A person's not makbid, and he would be mamana. He would appoint a son. I read it. Mi mashve inish bra shlicha makom. He's not makbid, and he would be mamana a son as a shlich in the presence of his father. Olo, or it's not a kavod for the Abba if he appoints his son. And therefore, even though he said Beit Shreimi Naichu, he said 2 out of you 3, he certainly didn't have in mind the son of the Malame Tinokos, but rather he had in mind the Malame Tinokos and the other person who was there. We called him Yehuda. So now that the Malame Tinokos died, the shlichus is bottled. Rav Nachman Omar Machlokas Amoraim on this question, Lo Mashvi Nishbrat Shlicha Makom Abba. Person would not normally appoint a shliach, a son, in the presence of his father, and therefore the shlichus is bottled. Rav Papi Omar Mashvi Inish Bra Shlicha Makom Abba. It's quite common for a person to appoint a shliach, a son, as a shliach, even in the presence of his father. Therefore, now, even though the father died, the Malame Tinokos is no longer alive, the Ben, together with that other person, can write the get. It is a regular occurrence that you can be mamana, a person would be mamana, Ben, in the presence of the father. Now we get to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Samach Vav, baby. Orma l'shnaim tnu get li'ishti.